for coming to my talk about Please Send to Ray Johnson. Oh, suddenly it's so quiet, nerve-wracking. When I started cataloging the museum's collection in 2015, I basically was working off a spreadsheet with thousands of acquisitions that had come through the museum, and one of the exciting points of that was finding an excessive amount of objects by Ray Johnson in the inventory, but they had not actually been cataloged. We had the framed works were cataloged and easily accessible, but then there were over 40, 50 pieces that had no other indication as to what they were. And as I was moving through the collection in our storage space in Riverhead, I kept my eye out for them because I'm a Ray Johnson fan, and I was very excited to see what this material would be. So I believe Casey and I were over there last spring, and I opened up a flat file and found a stack of manila folders and opened them up. They said Ray Johnson on them. I opened them up, and each one contained most of the material that you see here. As I started digging through them and photographing them and doing research, it became clear that they were all sent to a gentleman named Ted Carey. We have over 8 paintings by Ted in the collection, and so I did a little research about who Ted was and a little bit of research about where these things came from. And at the end of the day, after doing all of this cataloging and researching more about Ray Johnson, it became clear to me that the connections between Ray and Tito Spiga, who donated all of these works, were part of the bigger picture of Guildhall and what it is and what the collection is. So I'm going to revert to this piece, which is titled An Evening at a Makbakia. We actually had, these are one of the connections that sort of made me dig deeper. We have a painting by Ted Carey titled A Makbakia. Makbakia was a film by Man Ray, and it also means leave me alone in Basque. So developing that connection was part of what led me to the Ted and Ray connection. Basically, Ted Carey was a good friend of Ray Johnson's. Ted was the companion of Tito Spiga, who is our gallery that Sarah Krindler's show is in across the way, was donated to Guildhall by Tito Spiga when he passed away. Prior to Tito's passing away, Ted became ill, and Ted and Tito wanted to donate works to the permanent collection of Ted's. So we accessioned these paintings, and then Tito became invested in Guildhall's permanent collection, in part because of that, also because of his relationship with Helen Harrison, who I'll talk a little bit more about based on that silhouette. So basically, Tito and Ted were companions. Ted passed away, and they donated these paintings to Guildhall. And then later on, Tito decided to donate his entire estate to Guildhall. We have a number of Warhol works that Tito donated and other pieces. Some of the stronger pieces, I think, in our collection were donated by Tito, and this is how we came upon all of these letters from Ray to Ted. It's kind of a long and circuitous story, as everything is with Ray Johnson. So if I digress, it is part of the bigger picture, but you can feel free to rein me in if I go too far. So one of the letters that I found early on was this one to Ted Carey with in the address line it says a Makbakia. So that sort of like became kind of full circle about these 3 different pieces in the collection that were connected to each other. And again, when Tito donated the estate, there was a tremendous amount of paperwork and works on paper, objects that weren't necessarily framed and readily accessible. So I guess I'll move on from that fact. But so each one of these sort of sections in the vitrines are the contents of one envelope. Usually the envelope is there, sometimes it's not. So if you look through you know, each of the vitrines, you can see there's an envelope and the contents of that envelope, which was, they don't always make a lot of sense. Ray was sort of a compulsive filer of media and information. From what I've read, what he would do is he would get kind of fixated on something about a person and then collect material that related to them. There's an artist named Billy Name. He would hoard pictures of cowboys and horses and then send those things off. So the interesting thing about this in the bigger picture in terms of Ray Johnson's career is that this is just one slice of what he did. He developed this movement. He didn't develop mail art, the mail art movement, but he really sort of took it to another level. He spent his entire life doing this sort of mail art activity where he would send an envelope full of material to one person, encouraging them to either do something to it or send it on to another person. And this became the New York Correspondence School. And basically, Ray had a house full of this material that he would just periodically send out to friends or strangers or celebrities, people that were in the news at the time. One of the interesting things about him is that he had a real true academic upbringing, not upbringing, but education. He studied at Black Mountain College with Joseph Albers and Robert Motherwell, Annie Albers, Gropius, any number of really important people at a time that was really fruitful in terms of Fluxus and a number of other sort of new forms of generating art. So I'm going to circle back again, and basically, so as I was saying, this is just one slice of Ray's work, but he communicated with any number of people. When I started organizing this show, I had people coming out of the woodwork offering to lend pieces, but because it's a permanent collection show, and obviously the contents here is plenty, a number of people came up to me and expressed their regrets of having thrown these things away. Oftentimes Ray would send something to a stranger who had no knowledge of him or his work and be confounded by why he would be sending things to them. It was creepy. He would frequently encourage them to send things on to other people, and they wouldn't. They might throw them away. They might stash them in a drawer somewhere. And so I've met a number of people who have really regretted having tossed them and ignored his directives. Actually, I should point out that Joan Harrison and her husband worked on these photographs, these 5 photographs, which we have 8 of. She was a friend of Ray's and worked on this photography project with him at his encouragement. Well, the interesting thing, one of the many sort of interesting things about Ray is that after Black Mountain College, he moved to New York. He became friends with Robert Rauschenberg and, Andy Warhol, any number of people. The day that Andy Warhol got shot by Valerie Solanas, not killed, shot, but just shot, Ray was mugged at knife point. And 2 days later, John F. Kennedy was killed. And he just sort of turned his back on the city and left and moved to Glen Cove, Long Island. He basically didn't, he was a fairly reclusive person to begin with, I think, but when he moved to Glen Cove, he really retreated, and then a year later he moved to Locust Valley, where he lived until he died. He did not have a lot of visitors there. He took phone calls and communicated with people through mail, but I think other than friends on Long Island, according to all the material that I've read, he really sort of retreated from the art world.
From the art world,
yeah.
He would tell me that he was going out to see Peter Beard in Montauk.
Right.
He had seen Caroline Kennedy the other night.
Yeah.
But he wasn't that much of a recluse
yeah.
at home because he'd come to every local art opening.
Which is wonderful, he sort of
do performance pieces.
Right.
In the very early 70s, I was a college student, and I don't remember how I made the connection, but I got invited to, I was part of the correspondence school, and I got invited to a dinner. I remember sitting next to Ray, and he introduced me to champagne.
Wow.
Well, you know, one bottle of wine Chateau was really good, and I discovered good champagne.
Right.
And so, and I remember meeting him a few times in the city.
Yeah. I think that sometimes the people tend to sort of elevate the more dramatic elements of an artist's career. I mean, clearly he was out and about, and I think you can see through the correspondence that he does talk about interacting with people. But in terms of running parallel to these other much bigger artists, he really did withdraw from, and this is part of the whole mail art concept, was that it was a way of sharing your work without working within an institution or the gallery system. He was really sort of pushing back against the roles that everyone had to play, and just wanted to create. I think when he moved into that house, he said, you know, I will only focus on the work and really, you know, be able to create as much as possible, and I would assume without the distractions or the pressures. But that said, for all of that, he had an exhibition at the Whitney of mail art in the 70s. He continued to show, and he was solicited to exhibit. Helena Harrison actually told me that he did 2 shows on Long Island during his lifetime. One was at the Nassau County Museum of Art in Roslyn, and Helen Harrison told me that he didn't go into the opening at all. He stayed in the parking lot and hung out with his friends, exactly, in the bushes. And then the other exhibition that he had on Long Island was actually at Elaine Benson Gallery, which anyone who's local is fairly familiar with. It was an exhibition of his silhouettes, which there's one here of Ted Carey, who is the recipient of all of this material. And it's actually posted to Helen Harrison. That would have been the year that she left Guildhall. This piece would have been sent to Helen the same year that Alfonso Osorio passed away. And Ted Dragon was Alfonso's companion. So I mean, this is, again, a really wonderful connection to the East End, and sort of talks about the ways in which Ray sort of brought people together and made connections. I would like to believe that that's some sort of tribute to Ted Dragon's support of Alfonso, and sort of acknowledging a major event, the passing of an important artist on the East End. So that's the same way that Amak Bakia sort of circles back. This also kind of leads you into these wonderful stories about Ray and his connections and contacts. And I don't even know that he had a relationship with Alfonso Osorio or Ted Dragon necessarily, but the acknowledgement of things that were happening in the world at the time, I think, are a big part of the exhibition and this body of work. And again, it's a sliver, it's a small section of time. Alan Lindenfeld is here. We have a piece that Ray actually sent to Alan. It was meant to go to Alan, but it never actually ended up in his hands. This piece here, which says, from Carice Crosby of Black Sun Press to Alan Lindenfeld, care of Ted Carey. So clearly Ted received this piece and chose to hang on to it instead of sending it on to Alan. This is one of the quirky things about Ray. Carice Crosby was the inventor of the American bra, assuming it was sort of in existence prior. She's the one who actually, and she was, this is something that Ray was really interested in, was, celebrity debutantes, the sort of very wealthy class and their lives. And she was born into a wealthy family, was married to a very prominent gentleman, and left him for her husband, who she and her husband went on to found Black Sun Press, which was an early publication company that would go on to print early works of authors such as Hart Crane and Hemingway. So she kind of crosses both lines, where she was a very well-known, I keep losing that word, debutante type person who went on to be involved in the art world. And there are a lot of people in these letters that sort of function that way. I'll move on to, this is another really interesting piece. Ray often did these how to draw a bunny. This one is called How to Draw a Tender Button. Tender Buttons was a gallery that was founded in 1964 in Manhattan, and it was named after Gertrude Stein's 1914 book. It was a rumination of small objects. The book was just essays about small objects by Gertrude Stein. So this again is sort of like got multi-layered associations to the art world, the literary world, and then he's gone on to just sort of illustrate how one might draw a tender button. There's a lot of sort of wordplay in Ray's work. If you sort of walk around the gallery, you'll see a lot of these doodles throughout, often babar, with a fairly phallic reference to his nose, the elephant, the children's book. You have here a really sweet letter to Ted when he was unwell about a package that Ray was trying to deliver to him, a sick package. This also has, this is sort of the phallus corner. There are a lot of references to that in here. There are collages that are basically to and about Michael Finley, who was a sort of pornographer that Ray seemed fascinated with. If you have a chance to watch the video, you'll see Lawrence Weiner is on there talking about Ray seeming fixated on whether or not he'd ever cross-dressed. And he'll tell you in the video how odd it was that Ray just kept coming back to him and asking him questions about whether or not he ever did, would he, if he did, what would he do? So again, as I said, he would keep these files related to people and things that he would attach to them and just sort of obsess over them. As a audience member looking at this show is important is that there isn't a lot of obvious logic to the pieces. I didn't organize them chronologically because that didn't necessarily make sense. I organized them in terms of their relationships to each other. And I think if you're looking through the show, it's important to not try to make too much sense of it. I think you just have to kind of absorb what you want. When I was working on the exhibition and the checklist and the labels, I did a fair amount of research about each person that was mentioned in each letter. And that, again, just kind of kept opening up these different avenues. So I basically stuck to giving some background information on each of the people that are in the works, so that as audience members, you wouldn't have to do that work. You could actually kind of start to grasp some of what he was doing. We have Jaja and a babar elephant nose. This is just obviously like just a tear sheet from a magazine. But it's sort of one of the better, I think, illustrations of how he would use his sense of humor to sort of, he was constantly kind of mocking and appreciating people at the same time, as I think you can tell from looking around. Ray and Andy Warhol were both illustrating book covers in tandem while Ray was still in New York. And Ted and Andy were actually lovers for a long time, so I think there's a lot of Warhol crossover. I don't know that Ray and Andy were very close, but they definitely spent a fair amount of time together. And so a lot of the pieces in the show reference Andy. I do think that he might have been one of the people that Ray felt most closely affiliated with. Ray was actually doing collages. When he moved to New York, he was making abstract geometric paintings and abandoned that within 5-10 years and started doing these collages and would incorporate media and images of celebrities like Elvis or Shirley Temple well before Warhol started doing it, just as a reference. People often say that he was closer to founding pop art than Warhol was, but moved in a different direction, clearly. For example, some of the things that he would pull, this is in this collage, piece of mail art, it's not actually a collage. That's another thing that's important, I think, to mention when I spoke to the Ray Johnson estate, who has they have an incredible website, and if you ever want to know anything about Ray Johnson, it's just the most in-depth website I've experienced, and easily accessible. And they actually have a PDF of definitions of who every relationship to Ray was. But I kind of went to them hoping that they would support framing a lot of this work, and they actually made a very clear definition that they don't see the mail art as artworks. They don't want them framed. They would prefer, I mean, they don't get to dictate what anyone does with what they own, but they prefer that the mail art is displayed more as ephemera than as artwork, because, in part, it moved around so much. There were so many people that would put their hands on it or change it, or it would just transfer around so much so that you couldn't actually just call it a Ray Johnson work. But he would pull things from the media, such as this piece, which you can't really see, is a very famous Ed Ruscha painting called Ruby. And one of the frustrating things about cataloging these pieces is that often they will be sort of sealed or taped down. This one is actually, there's material underneath this where the piece folds over, and we can't access it without destroying the work. So it's a little bit of a trick in a way. At one point, Ray Johnson was very friendly with Christo and Jean-Claude, who are famous for doing these big wrapped artworks, and they had done a number of pieces where they would just wrap a small package and that would be the artwork. Ray wrote to them and asked them if he could buy one, or he couldn't afford one at a gallery, could he access one. They ended up making one, taking a photograph of it, putting the photograph in and rewrapping the package and sending it to him. And Ray then received the package, opened it up, and inside was just the photograph and said, "We sent you the piece that you wanted, but you've destroyed it in the process." So there's all this, like, you know, sort of horrible, they were doing to him what he was doing to other people, this like kind of trickery. This piece actually is particularly interesting. I've got to get this. It's a page from Look magazine from 1971 featuring Anton LaVey, who was he was the high priest of the First Church of Satan. That is less interesting to me than the fact that there is this little emotico, or it's called a motico. Ray, when he was sort of transitioning from making these geometric paintings and collages, would sort of created this visual language by breaking down images to their sort of core shapes. And then he would constantly be reworking collages and materials. And he started just pasting these collages together on shirt cardboard and sanding them down and reworking them and sanding them down. So this piece is especially interesting because it contains a motico, which is kind of closer to an artwork than mail art. There's another one in the Amak Bakia piece that I showed you earlier. Then there are also just, you know, sort of more straightforward letters. This is an example of one, but Ray would find stationery, random stationery, and sort of that had some kind of interesting quirk to it, and appropriate that into a letter, was just corresponding with people on other people's stationery. He would find envelopes that from businesses or things that he found interesting and use those and write on them and readdress them. So that's like sort of just another layer of confusion and chaos, but also associations, which I think is really, I would say, one of the, I think, more exciting parts of Ray's work is these random associations, or at least random in your mind until you do, you know, the backtracking work. Ray started, when he started the New York Correspondence School, he also started doing sort of offshoots of that. It would be like, for example, this one is the Silhouette University. And it was just a list of people that he has drawn silhouettes of. And we have another copy of this that has a handwritten, he would just handwrite notes in. So he would make photocopies of his own work and then add to them and send them out again. This is The Invisible Woman's Spit, first New York Correspondence School spitting, just a list of people's spit. There was also the Jane Fonda, I think there was a Jane Fonda fan club. That letter over there is actually announcing Jane Fonda's being kicked out of the New York Correspondence School. I'm certain that if I researched that date, there would probably be some public incident that inspired him to do that. But again, if you spend the time and you know, or even if there's something in here that relates to something that you know, dig a little bit deeper and you'll find sort of more and more associations. And then as far as the clubs, there were various fan clubs, and these were all sort of like, I think, ways of his organizing this kind of compulsive need to catalog people and events and things that were happening in the world at the time, which I think, again, is a really interesting thing about his work. It is a reflection of what was going on in the world while Ray was making this work. I was recently speaking to a gentleman who makes specifically male art, and he's actually reviewing the show as we speak, and he was saying basically that, you know, all of these people that maybe didn't, again, have access to gallery exhibitions or museum exhibitions had the opportunity to share their work and continue making art and feeling as if it was being seen by other people without having to work in the gallery system. So Ray moved to Locust Valley, kind of retreated to some degree from the art world. And in 1995, he checked into a motel in Sag Harbor and proceeded to jump off of the Sag Harbor-Noyac Bridge, January of 1995. Apparently there were 2 girls on the bridge or near the bridge at the time who saw him backstroking off into the water, and then his body was found the following day. I've spoken to Helen Harrison about this, and she speculated that he wasn't actually trying to commit suicide. He had a complete clean bill of health, money in the bank, no drugs in his system. But when the police started researching who he was, they actually called around. Helen was one of the people that they called because they found his address book. And they were just trying to piece together who Ray was and why he would do this. He had checked into a hotel room. He chose to do it on January 13th. He checked into a hotel room with the numbers of the hotel room adding up to the number 13. There were like a lot of clues that this was a very, you know, sort of well laid out plan, but no suicide note. And when the authorities went to his house in Locust Valley to do their diligence, they basically found the house more or less empty with the exception of an enormous amount of boxes and files with artwork in them. Ray had been, his gallery had been trying to pursue a show with him for ages, at least, you know, a decade of time where they were trying to solicit him to do an exhibition for them, and he kept resisting. And he called Frances Beatty, who's the director of the estate, and said to her shortly before the suicide, said to her, "You're finally going to get your show." So in the documentary about Ray, which we screened at the museum last weekend, but it's also online if you want to watch it, it shows video of the house with just stacks and stacks and stacks of boxes, an air mattress, some clothes, the bare minimum. So the man was basically, to the best of my knowledge, I'm looking for Joan because she knew him at the time, but to the best of my knowledge, living incredibly minimally and just creating all this work. So when Frances Beatty had the opportunity to go into the house and found all of this artwork and all of these files and all of this sort of half-finished mail art, only in the sense that it hadn't been sent out yet, the estate took all of that work, became the estate, and they've since been circulating the material. And I think that Ray's career, at least in terms of his fame, really blossomed after his passing. He seemed to be so resistant to the idea of fame or working within the system, that when he actually departed, the rest of the world was really able to kind of dig in and see what he was doing. And he's since had an enormous amount of exhibitions. There was a show of collages. This is, again, just one facet of his career, mail art. He's done all of these really wonderful collages with mixed media. These two pieces are probably as close to that as we come with this show. But yeah, there was a show at Matthew Mark's gallery 2 years ago that was just gorgeous, and you really do see the connections to pop art, the foundations of pop art in his work, although I don't know that he ever claimed to be a pop artist. One example of what a trickster he was is this series of gallery announcements. They're flipped over because they have references to this list of how many people. It's a list of people that he's asked how many hamburgers they eat a week, and then the response or the sort of acknowledgement of that is him writing a letter to Ted Carey about these people eating hamburgers, and then this little stack of gallery announcements in which he discusses Jackie Curtis eating hamburgers. But on the verso of these cards are announcements to exhibitions that he and several other friends were putting up that were not really shows. Ray did a number of performances called Nothings, as opposed to happenings, where he would show up, everyone would show up at the gallery, nothing would happen, and then he would drop a box of spools down a stairwell, or do something, or yeah, exactly. Kind of, again, like a pushback, a sort of the antithesis of what was happening. And it sounds silly, but it actually is really, or not silly, but it sounds kind of irritating, but it actually is a very kind of curious way of interpreting what was happening at the time. But these exhibition announcements were fake shows. They were three-man shows with a list of 4 artists with their names spelled wrong. And the curators were just made up. I mean, this is, again, a lot of digging that I had to do into other rare book dealers and ephemera dealers and looking at the descriptions of the works that they had. So I found someone who was selling one of these cards that basically described, these fake artists and these fake exhibitions. His name is spelled Faye Johnson on these cards, and there's another section of work that mentions Spinney Walker, and I spent hours trying to figure out who Spinney Walker was until I found some ephemera salesperson who said Spinney Walker was just another made-up name of a curator for an exhibition. Again, questions, please, if you have them.
The Central Hall one was a real exhibit, a real.
Oh yes, yeah.
That one.
Yeah.
Louis Cabinet.
Yeah, I love the fact that there are all these exhibitions that took place on Long Island after he left. I think it would appear that he really sort of generated maybe a more exciting art scene that wouldn't have otherwise existed in Nassau County. And again, he made an enormous amount of trips out here, had a lot of friends out here. There are some very tongue-in-cheek references to Edward Albee, lots of jokes about, I think Jamie's reading one now that says that he spent a wild and wonderful wet weekend with Richard Serra, and basically just sort of mocking the art world as much as he is acknowledging it, mocking it. There's a list of works that Ted Carey lent to an exhibition in North Carolina, which was one of the major exhibitions of mail art, or of art that Ray had during his lifetime. There's a playbill from an exhibition, from a play that Ray sent to James Lord, and who was famous for writing the Giacometti book, the book about Giacometti doing a drawing of James Lord, in which he tells how many urinals, toilets, and stalls there were in the theater venue. And so it's all like really mundane, not all, but a lot of it is sort of silly and mundane, but it also just, again, is constantly making references to other artists, important figures in the art world, and and maybe, you know, I've learned a tremendous amount about artists that I'd never heard of before, literary figures, in the process of putting this show together. So if you have the time to take and really look at it and sort of pick it apart, there's a tremendous amount of layers to it. We have a number of catalogs here that were produced for exhibitions that he'd done, the Dollar Bill Show. Yeah, I guess, I don't know, I could keep going forever. Is anyone? I don't know. There are photocopies of Ray in wearing a woman's dress.
Yeah.
I sort of made the assumption that this might have been some sort of a happening. He's sort of being...
Do you know who she is?
No, I have no idea. I mean, again, that's the sad part of it. I would, you know, scan some of these things, drop them in Google Images, trying to find details about who they were, who people were. And there are other people have told me that they have the same photocopies. So again, he would photocopy, there would be the original work of art, then he would photocopy it and send it out again with a new scribble on it. The portrait of the gentleman with the mustache drawn on him, I've seen that image in other works, but the one that we have is actually written in red ink. That red ink is reproduced in black and white in other pieces, so clearly it had been photocopied and sent around again. So yeah, I mean, again, in the art world, the uniqueness of a piece is sort of in part what determines its value. So again, he was sort of playing with, I think, the value of an artwork by just copying it and regurgitating information constantly. So that's another exciting point. Yeah, so I mean, not everything that's here is unique, but most of it has been marked in one way or another with the artist's hands. Yeah, the doodles are also sort of the most iconic part, I think, of Ray Johnson's work. People recognize these doodles from, you know, they've sort of proliferated the art world for a long, long time, and you don't necessarily know that it's Ray, but you will definitely, I would imagine, when you leave here, notice bunny heads in other artworks or sort of throughout.
Did anything show you why he spelled correspondence as he did?
I think it was just being a tease. You know, he was always like really working the wordplay. You know, constantly finding double meanings for things. This is a great example of sort of the silly kind of spontaneous corresponding he did. This is a photograph of an artwork by Gillespie that he found in a magazine, and in addition to that, taped to that is a letter to, not Dear Abby, but I guess it was Ann Landers at the time, this woman is talking about finding a lump on her husband's chest and should she worry about it. And he goes ahead and draws a third nipple on the artwork done by this artist that he clipped from a paper. There's also the Susan Sontag photography. I mean, I think that these things, the things that he gravitated towards might look random, but I think for him, they all, you know, sort of most of the aspects of what's on the paper have some sort of other reference for him. I mean, Alan shared some fun stories with me about riding around with Ray in his bug, in his VW bug, driving around the city. And I mean, he was definitely out and about and sort of being a constant trickster, I think. Yeah.
I mean, even when he was in Locust Valley, he was very aware of everything that was going on in New York.
Right. Yeah. It seems like when he retreated from New York, he maybe even delved deeper into what was going on there. You know, started making more and more work about the people that he had sort of walked away from to some degree. But that was in the 60s, 70s that you, right, yeah.
And why was he so happy with this picture, besides the fact he looked so macho?
Right.
And that was an aspect of Ray you may not see.
It's
very important to him. His vitality, and not my feeling of why he committed suicide. Age.
Right,
kind of
wow.
thing. Yeah. But besides that, Joan, who photographed it, didn't even see this at the time. But this drain plate that's in the photograph, the manufacturer is on it, and it's Harrison.
Oh,
the name
goodness.
of the
Yeah,
photographer.
yeah.
And love that.
Yeah.
And that's something that nobody
On our sign.
And you have to imagine that his sense of observation to those things was so keen. I mean, there are photographs of him eating an ice cream cone in front of Howard Johnson's. You know, just that wordplay, that really sharp attention to these associations that, yeah, other people would not have noticed. It's kind of amazing. And I do think this might be a conclusion that I drew myself in part due to a lot of what I read, but it seems like this degree of collecting things and this activity of constantly sending them out and having them sent back to you and altering them again and then sending them out again and then seeing images of the house after he passed away, that it had to have become incredibly overwhelming at some point. I mean, just the production, you know, artists that produce a tremendous amount of work usually are sort of sending them off to places and they're gone and they have their own lives and maybe revisited for an exhibition or something, but he really seemed to constantly be reworking everything, and that must have just been overwhelming. But again, I would prefer not to get hyperbolic or too caught up in sort of these mysteries. It is definitely an enticing part of his career.
You go to his house after he's passed.
Mm-hmm.
You walk through this first room, which is like a small living room, which is empty, which
Mm-hmm.
he would create these little things for I don't know who, because no one came into the house. And then you come into his dining room, which only had a table, maybe a chair only, but stacks of artwork, neatly, precisely stacked all around the floor,
Right.
just coming up. Many, many thousands of artwork. Just, it'd be overwhelming.
Yeah,
It's okay.
yeah, that's exactly kind of what is this slice, you know, just this one slice of correspondence between Ray and a friend, and again, only what Ted actually kept, what we received. I mean, you think about the number of people that are mentioned in all of these pieces, that they also might have received this much mail art as well in their friendship or lifetime with Ray. It's got to be absolutely overwhelming. The relationship that he had with these artists, again, even when the police were talking about trying to figure out who he was, no one had the full picture. Everyone had this little slice of what their relationship was. Maybe you were more helpful, but
He had his mailman.
did you? Yeah, I mean, the mailmen loved him. I mean,
Said, "What's
you
it
know,
like?" And he goes, "Man, there's some really
They-
weird stuff."
people would send, yeah. No, but they also said he was a lovely guy, you know, not terribly eccentric and just like pleasant and polite. But I mean, you can imagine his poor mailman just, you know, back and forth on a regular basis. And even after Ray passed, people would continue to send things to him, maybe just to get the postmark returned, you know, and then it becomes a piece of mail art, you know. They want to continue to perpetuate that. There's a really interesting, just the living situation in the house. If you can go home and look on the internet, you can see images of it. But Jim Rosenquist was talking about visiting Ray in the city when he was still living there, and that Ray had, you know, an empty apartment for the most part with a stack of books to the ceiling. And Rosenquist said to him, like, "Oh, that's a nice stack of books." And Ray said, "It's holding up the ceiling." And then aside from that, there's a piece of clothesline drawn across the room. And he said, "Oh, do you hang your clothes on there?" And he says, "Yeah, sometimes, but it's really just to separate the space." I mean, you just, you know, like, if you think about an artist whose entire life is about their work, I mean, I think he's sort of one of the better examples of that.
Would you object to that statement that it's just ephemera?
I understand, having been an art dealer, I understand the logic behind it. I don't think that it's just ephemera, but they want it.
World, considering what's
Yeah.
going on in today's art
Right. No, I don't. I think a lot of ephemera dealers have been dealing in it in terms of commerce. I think that the delineation that the estate was making was just trying to be clear about what the final artworks were versus the mail art, which had been circulated and intervened on, could not actually, be finally an artwork by. I mean, I guess it's more of a sort of a philosophical question. So, anyone else have any questions, or shall I keep boring you? Like, keep talking and talking? I really do appreciate you all coming out on a rainy, rainy day. Thanks.